We need thee every hour. O Lord, how we need thee. When we're puzzled, guide us with your hand of direction. When we're worn and wearied, grant us light to find a just and fair way. And when we're confused, anoint our priorities and pet projects so that any diminutive success may give you the glory. Receive now this prayer, O Lord. Amen.
And with that prayer, the 116th session of the United States Congress got underway here in Washington. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Amber Strong.
And I'm John Jessup. Well, after what has been described as the most consequential midterm elections in history, the latest group of lawmakers were sworn in and officially took their places on Capitol Hill.
For more, joining us now from the Hill is Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson. Abby, as we've been reporting, this session of Congress looks a little bit different from the last one.
That's right, Amber. This is the most diverse incoming Congress we have ever seen. This has been called the Year of Women in Politics. And for the first time in history, we're seeing almost 25% of the Senate and 25% of the House made up of women. That is more than we've ever seen before. And many states like Tennessee, Arizona, and Mississippi are sending their first female senators ever to Washington this year. So this is truly a historic incoming class.
Well, Abigail, Nancy Pelosi was officially voted in as Speaker of the House, as she noted, on the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. But this is her second time, and that in and of itself is fairly unprecedented, right?
That's right, John. She is the first person in nearly 6 decades to return to the speakership since Democrat Sam Rayburn from Texas many years ago. This is truly historic. She worked very hard to re-win this speakership. She's also the oldest person ever elected as Speaker and still the first and only woman to ever be Speaker of the House. And despite the fact that she's heading into this role while the government is still partially shut down, she spoke today on the House floor saying that she has great hope and confidence in the 116th Congress. Take a look.
We must be pioneers of the future. This Congress must accelerate a future that advances America's preeminence in the world and opens up opportunities for all. Building an economy that gives all Americans the tools they need to succeed in the 21st century. Public education, workforce development, good-paying jobs, and secure pensions. We have heard from too many families who wonder in this time of innovation and globalization if they have a place in the economy of the future. We must remove all doubt that they do and say to them individually, we will have an economy that works for you.
And even though a few members the past 2 years campaigned on new Democratic leadership in the House, she worked very hard to get the votes needed to become the next Speaker of the House. She got those people on board mainly because she gave herself a self-imposed term limit. She says she will only be Speaker of the House for the next 4 years if Democrats keep control of the House. And that's why today we only saw 12 Democrats vote against her and 3 vote present.
Wow. Now that the Democrats control the House, other than ending this shutdown, what are some of the other things on the agenda?
Well, fasten your seatbelts because so far the priorities we've heard about is investigating the Trump administration. This is going to be a long 2 years for the Trump administration. Democrats are going to do everything they can, for starters, to get President Trump's tax returns from the past decade or so. And they already have a slew of investigations that they're going to look into. And Democrat Congressman Brad Sherman says that he plans to introduce articles of impeachment against President Trump as early as today. So it's certainly going to be a long 2 years for the Trump administration under this Democrat-controlled House.
Abigail, we're tight on time, but real quickly, turning to the Senate, Republicans slightly gained in their majority and will soon be shifting their focus to some of the president's nominees for key roles. I hear something about Attorney General. Is that right?
That's true, John. The first one, that the Senate Judiciary Committee, they're holding a hearing January 15th for President Trump's new nominee for Attorney General William Barr. And then they will have many other hearings throughout this month because they have some new positions to replace after a few people resigned last month. So they're going to be busy doing that and also continuing to confirm President Trump's judicial nominees.
Thanks, Abby. Well, as those charged with controlling the government were sworn in today, the country is about to enter into its second week of a partial shutdown.
And while the pomp and circumstance was taking place on the Hill, the president was just a few miles away at the White House tweeting about the shutdown and the need for a border wall with Mexico.
White House correspondent Ben Kennedy joins us now for the latest on the shutdown. Ben.
Well, Amber and John, today there is pressure on President Trump to reopen key parts of the government, but it doesn't appear Democrats plan to budge on the president's border wall. So we're at a bit of a stalemate at the moment, which means the shutdown continues. I just sat down with Trump's former economic advisor, Stephen Moore, to get his take on the impact this shutdown is having nationwide. Steve, it's day 13. What kind of impact is the partial government shutdown having on the economy as we go into week 3?
In terms of the economic impact, I think really small. I think outside of Washington, D.C., most Americans probably don't even know the government is shut down. And let's not forget, you know, about 70% of the government is still operating. It's just some of the non-essential agencies like the Commerce Department are not open, but that doesn't affect most people's lives.
Steve, depending on how long the shutdown lasts,
yes.
The 800,000 workers that is impacting, do you feel it'll have some sort of a domino effect to affect the markets? Will they be spending less in the short term, possibly long term?
It's a small negative for the economy, small negative, but not big in the whole course of events.
According to a new Axios poll, most Americans think the economy is doing very well, but are worried that a recession could happen this year. Could this partial government shutdown take us down that path?
I'm not too surprised that Americans are saying they're worried about a recession. You know why? Because that's all the media has been saying, you know, for the last few weeks. Oh, recession is right around the corner. All these economists think a recession is coming. They don't know. We don't know. If you ask me if there's going to be a recession in 2019, I'd say I don't really see one, but recessions can just, you know, massively come upon you unexpectedly, and I wouldn't bet my life that it's not going to happen. But as I look at the overall fundamentals of the U.S. economy right now, I see a lot of strength. I mean, we saw a big Christmas season for shoppers and for retailers. We've got the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. We still have 7 million more jobs than people to fill them. I just wrote my column basically saying that 2018 was the year of the American worker. This is the best time in 50 years to be a worker looking for a new job. That doesn't sound like a recession environment to me.
Now, Kevin Hassett, chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, said that some 300,000 federal government furloughs could translate to a big negative in the January jobs numbers. Now, those numbers are set to be released sometime tomorrow. President Trump stated that the shutdown could go on for a very long time, as long as it takes, he said. Lawmakers were invited to the White House here behind me to try and hash out a deal tomorrow with the hope of bringing this shutdown to a close. That is the latest from the White House. Ben Kennedy, CBN News.
Well, as we've been reporting, Washington now enters an era of divided government. To offer some perspective on what that means, we turn to the guy who has all the answers, Chief Political Analyst David Brody.
You said perspective.
Perspective. David, I guess the first thing we should address is there's a difference between legislative power and subpoena power.
Correct. Legislative power, Nancy Pelosi has that. The Democrats have that. Good luck with that, because President Trump's going to veto everything, and it won't even get to the Senate floor unless it, of course, has the votes and it's bipartisan, maybe infrastructure, things like that. So legislative power, they're not going to be able to do too much. Gavel-wise, the gavel power, different story. Let's take a look at some of that, for example. There's going to be a lot of investigations into this White House, and I can tell you that right now. There's going to be that parallel to the Mueller probe. There's no doubt about that. And there's going to be a lot more. They're going to subpoena his tax returns, I guarantee you the Trump White House is going to fight that as well. And then, of course, the financial relationship with Saudi Arabia and Russia. And speaking of financial relationships, they're going to look into potential money laundering that the Democrats believe was going on at Trump Tower or the Trump Organization. So we'll see.
Wow. Yesterday, President Trump said that Nancy Pelosi was, quote, a good Catholic. and should endorse the wall because the Vatican has walls. Any chance of that actually happening?
Let me think. No. No, it's not going to happen.
Quick.
Yeah, no, she's not going to endorse that. But it's interesting he brought up her Catholic faith because she is a staunch Catholic. A lot of Catholics might have some issues with her pro-choice stance. But the truth of the matter is, she went to an all-Catholic girls' high school. She also went to an all-Catholic college as well, which is interesting. Of course, she comes from this big Italian Catholic family. So she's got roots, and she has been struggling. She says she struggles with the life issue. She's been doing it for a long time, even though she's what she calls herself pro-choice. Most of her family pro-life. Of course, we know the Pope and the Catholic teaching on that subject.
David, there's a new crowd in town, a lot of fresh faces, like incoming Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who describes herself as a democratic socialist. How is Nancy Pelosi going to wrangle her diverse caucus?
This is going to be very difficult, but it is the skill that she does best. There's no doubt. She's good at wrangling, as someone would say. I don't know who would say that. So it's going to be difficult. Here's what I'm going to be looking for. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the media has, whatever you want to call it, fallen in love with her, or at least fallen in love with her tweets. Every time she tweets, they do stories on it, and there's a narrative out there. How does Nancy Pelosi react to some of the probably pretty progressive, pretty provocative things that she's going to say, including this Green New Deal that we've heard so much about? And I think that is something to watch. Nancy Pelosi, has to be very careful that the caucus doesn't go too far left. Amber, you've done stories on this. I mean, they got to be careful, and I think that's going to be her challenge. But Nancy Pelosi has proven that she's pretty good at doing that.
Absolutely. Last question really quickly. There are parallels between this Congress, this far-left progressive group that you mentioned, and the Tea Party in 2010. Do you see those parallels, and how do they push past that as a group? There's
no doubt. Real quick, 2010, Tea Party came in a huge storm. It was 60 plus or so that came in. Same thing here, progressives though. So left this time, the right more that time. Bottom line is there was a lot of energy, and the party, the mainstream Republicans at the time, and today the mainstream Democrats have to figure out how to deal with all those whippersnappers on the left and right. Yes, I said whippersnappers.
I love it. David Brody, thank you so much for your insights.
Pleasure, guys. Thanks.
Well, it may surprise some that today's new Congress began with a prayer and that lawmakers are still sworn in on Bibles. But as Paul Strand reports, when Thomas Jefferson wrote a wall of separation between church and state, he never meant for that phrase to become the grounds to keep lawmakers and other Americans from practicing their faith in the public forum.
America's Constitution resides here in the National Archives. Its Bill of Rights protects freedoms such as speech, the press, and religion. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Today's prevailing opinion believes that means government and God can have nothing to do with each other, thus creating a high wall separating church and state. But what did the Founding Fathers who wrote it actually mean?
When the founders talked about separation of church and state, they had a historical context that we really lack.
Reverend Eddie Hyatt, author of Pilgrims and Patriots.
Church and state was merged together, and the church used the power of the state to enforce its doctrines and practices.
He says certain governments used deadly force against dissenters who wanted to worship in their own way.
Those people were persecuted, burned at the stake. Some had their tongues cut out. The founders did not want that kind of Christianity.
And so that's the context they have of separation of church and state. It was never the church taking over the state, it's always the state taking over the church.
Author Jerry Newcomb, who wrote the book that made America, says the founders opposed such force.
They didn't want to have a national established Church of America like you have the Church of England, forcing people to believe something that they didn't believe in.
Thomas Jefferson wrote to worried pastors in a famous 1802 letter assuring them government wouldn't interfere with their faith.
Because there's a wall of separation between church and state. And so the way he used it is, guys, the government's not going to stop religious activities.
Then almost 150 years later, more liberal justices and judges began to interpret that to mean government had to wall off any touch of faith on any public institution or the people in it.
William Federer, author of the daily American Minute.
And that's when they began to reinterpret that phrase to say, no, we're going to get faith and God and everything out.
Such as the 1980 Supreme Court ruling that kicked the Ten Commandments out of public schools.
They said if the Ten Commandments were on the schoolroom wall, the children might read them, meditate on them, venerate them, and obey them.
We got to make sure that kid doesn't say God at graduation. You can't let a kid pray over their lunch.
Hyatt says the founders would be distressed by these rulings.
to ban Bible reading and prayer from public schools, remove crosses and Ten Commandment displays from public places.
Attorney Jeremy Dice fights for religious rights.
When the government tells you what you can believe and what you cannot believe, that is a significant loss in our freedom.
It's ironic that judges will say, well, we have to maintain separation of church and state. They're quoting from Jefferson, and Jefferson in the Declaration said all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Here's Jefferson acknowledging he believed in a creator, and they're using his phrase out of context to prohibit a creator.
In that same letter, Jefferson showed where he stands.
At the end of it, Thomas Jefferson says, will you please pray to God for me, and I will pray to God for you. He violates the separation of church and state in the very letter that gave us the phrase.
And right after he wrote it,
President Jefferson left the White House to go to the United States Capitol at the time to do what? To go to church that Sunday.
In the Capitol.
In the United States Capitol buildings.
The U.S. Supreme Court has more than 50 depictions of the Ten Commandments in its own building.
George Washington was sworn in on the Holy Bible. He said, so help me God, which was the common way of taking oaths. George Washington even leaned down and kissed the Holy Bible.
They did not want a national church, but they wanted God in all of their proceedings.
So, you know, if their idea was, well, there should be no reference to God in our government, then the founders, you know, absolutely were schizophrenic. They absolutely did not mean the separation of God and government.
As Newcomb put it, while the founders made religious freedom a priority, they certainly did not intend to make America into some sort of secular wasteland. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from the National Archives.
When we come back, we take a look at what the Democratic House could mean for defense spending.
Tikkun Olam.
This is our nature as a country.
To make the world a better place.
Literally, we felt the earth shaking.
The Christian Broadcasting Network presents To Life, how Israeli volunteers are changing the world.
This film needs to be seen by everyone.
I was in tears.
Now you can own the inspiring documentary To Life on DVD.
There is blood on our hands if we know and we walk away.
I'm so grateful that this film was made.
To Life can be yours for a gift of $10 or more. Call 1-800-700-7000 or log on to cbn.com.
We know that every minute counts to save life.
It'll bless Israel, but it'll also bless all the friends of Israel.
Discover the untold story of how Israeli volunteers are making the world a better place. Call 1-800-700-7000 or log on to cbn.com to get your copy today.
Region's first ROTC graduate student.
The newly minted Democratic-controlled House is already talking about cutting the Pentagon's budget.
Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton has warned the defense budget will flatten out because of the growing national debt. And those limits on defense spending could spell trouble for the U.S. in the years ahead.
I went to the Pentagon to bring you this story about the country's waning military edge. The United States could lose a war with China or Russia. That according to a new report commissioned by Congress. This deep look at our national defense strategy finds the U.S. military has potentially lost its edge when stacked up against global powers. It's the most technologically advanced member of the Navy's fleet. As part of a growing defense budget, the USS Zumwalt is a stealth-capable guided missile destroyer with a price tag of some $4 billion.
The stronger we are, the less chance we have of having to go to war.
The president is touting the increase as the largest military budget in U.S. history, at least 4 times the size of China's defense budget and more than 10 times that of Russia. But a new report to Congress shows signs of an eroding military edge, warning the U.S. could lose a war against powers like China or Russia.
It's a real dire warning. This is a flashing red light.
John Hanna is the former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney.
The United States risks real strategic insolvency and the danger that we could lose regional wars in critical theaters of operations.
Defense Secretary James Mattis said he was humbled by the largest defense budget in history. Now, it sounds like it might not be enough.
I hope we can avoid an arms race. The challenge we face right now is that the Army is as small as it's been since the Second World War. The Navy is, I think, on track to be smaller than it has been since the First World War. And the Air Force is the smallest it's ever been.
Eric Edelman is the co-chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission. The bipartisan report to Congress warns that available resources for every branch of the military are clearly insufficient if the U.S. were to fight a global power and deter other enemies simultaneously.
Our technology is far superior to anybody else. Our jet fighters, even our tankers, but our planes, our ships, there's nobody that makes the equipment like we make it.
But that equipment comes at a price. While rising global powers have invested heavily in new high-end capabilities, American interests have concentrated on a different kind of fight. As the U.S. military trained its fire on terrorism wrought by violent Muslim extremists in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Syria for the last 15 years, China and Russia have been busy developing highly sophisticated military weapons, like this Russian hypersonic Kinzhal missile.
No missile defense system will be able to withstand it.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says it can carry nuclear warheads and hit targets over 1,000 miles away at speeds 10 times faster than the speed of sound.
Now we have new kinds of technologies coming online that are going to change things up a bit: hypersonics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, things like that.
Another new report from the Government Accountability Office warns there are no existing countermeasures to defend against these hypersonic weapons. Experts say the American military needs to redirect.
China's military budget is likely to double by 2030 and certainly at least double again by mid-century. At that point, it would be larger than today's U.S. military budget.
Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution says if China's economy keeps growing, so will its military. And they're not the only problem.
Russia, first of all, is not going to overtake us, but they may have enough to be a big problem anyway. They've got 5,000 nuclear weapons, just like we do. They have conventional superiority in regions where we have allies we are sworn by treaty to defend. So they're big enough to be a problem. And even if their budget's only 1/10 of ours.
Despite Russia's relatively small defense budget, its nuclear arsenal remains a threat.
Nuclear deterrence is tricky because what matters is not what we think would deter somebody, but what they think.
Edelman, an American diplomat and former defense official, warns that both Russia and China are investing in new nuclear weapons and delivery platforms.
We've grown very complacent about this because since 1945 nobody has used nuclear weapons in anger, and so I think there's a tendency to think no one will ever do this.
With the exception of North Korea and Iran, no armed state is likely to launch a premeditated attack. The most imminent worry for experts we talk to is the cyber realm.
Cyber attack has the potential appeal of incapacitating us without killing anybody immediately or directly. If the electricity grid goes down, a lot of Americans will die.
Even if the U.S. were to retaliate, a country like Russia is less susceptible to cyber attacks.
Russia might decide that all we're going to do is cyber attack them back. It's one thing in the heat of the moment to punch back against somebody that just hit you. It's something else if it takes a year or two. So maybe Russia's theory of victory would be the Americans will lose heart if we can just slow them down.
And experts we talked to said there's huge uncertainty about whose tools are better in the cyber realm. Even at a historic $716 billion, the U.S. is still spending less in terms of GDP on defense than 3 decades ago under Ronald Reagan.
Wall Street took a deep dive today after word from Apple that iPhone sales in China are falling. On the second trading day of the year, the Dow ended the day with big losses, down more than 650 points at the closing bell. We'll be back with more after this.
I am Region's first ROTC graduate student.
At least 5 people could face the death penalty over the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. 11 suspects had their first court hearing in Saudi Arabia today. State media reports prosecutors are seeking death in some of the cases. The CIA says the order to kill Khashoggi came directly from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, but the Trump administration has continued its support of him, maintaining the Saudis are a crucial ally in the Middle East.
Well, an American traveling in Russia faces formal charges of espionage tonight. Paul Whelan was arrested in Moscow on December 28th while attending a wedding, according to his family. But Russia's Federal Security Service says he's a spy, an accusation his brother says he can't imagine.
I can't think of any plausible reason that Paul was arrested in Russia.
If the detention is not appropriate, we will demand his immediate return.
U.S. Ambassador to Russia John Huntsman visited with Whelan Wednesday and says he's in good condition. Whelan's arrest comes after confessed Russian agent Maria Butina pleaded guilty to trying to infiltrate political circles right here in the United States. Some foreign affairs experts say Whelan's arrest may be used as leverage as a potential prisoner swap. Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation.
We'll see you tomorrow.